Hello again. So this video will be an introduction to Othello, the play itself, some of the historical context, the film adaptation that you'll be watching, and thinking about critical literary theory in terms of looking at the play through those lenses. So if you remember, it seems like a year ago, but that Monday before spring break when we last met, I gave you a few handouts specifically about Othello and then more broadly about critical literary theory. All of those are up on Moodle as well. Hopefully you have looked through them, you've kind of familiarized yourself with some of the, again, Shakespeare specific and then more broad literary analysis that we will be thinking about and looking at as we delve into Othello further. So this video will be, I will be talking along with a PowerPoint. It's up on Moodle as a file as well, about some of the historical context, things to be thinking about as you read and watch. We'll be talking about the film adaptation that you're watching, things to look out for, and critical literary theory. Again, thinking about how to apply that theory as you are reading and watching Shakespeare. And at the end of the video, I'll give a brief preview of your writing assignment that you'll be doing, kind of mixing all of these things together, Shakespeare's Othello, literary analysis, and critical literary theory. So here we go. All right. So Othello is one of Shakespeare's great tragedies. He wrote it and it was first performed later in his career. So 1604 is when Othello was likely first performed. Like most of Shakespeare's plays, it came from source material. And hopefully you've kind of read through your packets, you've read the introduction in your book and kind of read a little bit about that. That there was typically source material that Shakespeare used to create his plays. You'll find in Othello this kind of fascination with evil, and this was certainly something, and I'll get to this in a few minutes, this idea of evil and morality and good versus evil. And in Shakespeare's time, being at a time of great transition, culturally, historically, and thinking about all of the shifts in terms of history and culture that were happening at that time and how people were still had and always have had this fascination with evil. So throughout Othello, you'll find really kind of one of the major themes is the destruction of love through jealousy, but also how pride, greed, hate, prejudice, jealousy, all of those things that we kind of tend to associate with the seven deadly sins, right? Kind of part of human nature. Throughout Othello, we see this kind of focus on these things leading to people's downfalls, to put it mildly. So things to look at throughout Othello, certainly the poetic images and symbols that we've been practicing looking at throughout the whole semester. Something really specific to look at is Iago, who is our villain. He's certainly our antagonist. He's a fascinating character because of how evil he is. And he tells us frequently that he just kind of enjoys evil for sport. We'll talk a little bit more about some of his motivations, but my reading has always been that Iago is kind of trying to make up some kind of logical reason for his hatred for Othello. At the end of the first act, he says that, well, I've heard rumors that Othello slept with my wife. I don't know if it's true, but I'm going to pretend that it is. We see him kind of trying to grasp onto some reason. You know, Cassio gets promoted to lieutenant over Iago. He's upset about that. But we also, through his language and how he talks about people and how he talks about Othello in particular, we know that Iago is deeply racist and sexist. So how his feelings about Othello as a Black man, as someone who isn't Italian, isn't Venetian, his feelings about women, about Emilia and Desdemona. We see this kind of very, very deep hatred in Iago that he kind of tries to put some sort of logic behind, but he's really kind of obsessed and enjoys doing evil, and he tells us that as well. But early on, Iago refers to people in animalistic terms. You'll hear him make reference to animals a lot when he's talking about people. And so if you think about that use of imagery, if a person thinks that people are nothing more than animals, that shows kind of not like a deep compassion and respect for others, that we are no more than the beasts, right? So you'll find then throughout the play that other characters, whether it's when Cassio talks about losing his reputation and how if you don't have your reputation, that kind of spiritual part of a human being, what's left is bestial, you're nothing but an animal. Or when Othello starts to refer to people in kind of those animalistic terms, that signifies that Iago is working, that Iago's plans are working on those individuals when they start to use those kind of animal terms to refer to people. So look out for those things, that kind of imagery that gives meaning beyond face value. Jewels and money. So early on as well, at the end of Act 1, the cool thing about Shakespeare's plays is that I know that you may not totally get this experience reading one in the course of a semester, but if you ever take a class dedicated to Shakespeare's plays, or kind of immerse yourself in Shakespeare's plays, either reading or watching films, you'll soon find that there's a pretty clear outline. These things happen in Act 1, you meet all your characters, you kind of understand their motivations. The action is set up in Act 2, so you start to see kind of these patterns in the 5-act structure. In Act 1, you're introduced to most of your characters, and Iago pretty consistently lays out the plot of the play for us. In his soliloquies at the end of the early acts, he tells us what his plans are, how he plans on setting up Desdemona and Cassio and using Roderigo to ultimately lead to Othello's downfall. He tells us that. So I know that it's in incredibly poetic Elizabethan language, but Iago's basically giving us the spark notes of the play at the end of Act 1. But we see early on that Roderigo plays kind of the fool's role. Many of Shakespeare's tragedies employ someone who kind of is a fool, kind of silly, maybe someone who does literally has the role of the fool in a king's court. But Roderigo is definitely played for laughs. You see that definitely in the film version. He's overly emotional. He's in love with Desdemona and, just beside himself that she has married Othello. And so Iago very clearly is using Roderigo for his own gains. So he sees that Roderigo will be easily manipulated. And he also is making reference to taking Roderigo's money. So, put money in my purse. She's going to get tired of Othello. She's going to need a new husband. Then you'll be there waiting. And Iago offers to hang on to his money for him because Iago's very cunning and evil. And he's like, okay, I'm going to use this guy in all sorts of ways, including taking his money. But you'll find some innuendo and double meanings when they're talking about money and purses. She must have change. She must. So this idea that she will want to change sexual partners, and she'll want to have change, the money as like a dowry. So look for that innuendo and look for that double meaning. And a very important theme throughout Othello is both racism and misogyny. And it's fairly clear that Shakespeare is attempting to make a point about how tragedy occurs when people hold racist and sexist views. And you'll see that, and we'll kind of talk about that throughout the play. So Othello is a Black man in Venetian, and we talked about this before spring break, that this is one of Shakespeare's Roman plays. So he had to be incredibly savvy about the history and the context of the setting of his plays. So in Italy, in the Venetian army, the general had to be someone who was a foreigner, a non-Venetian. So Othello is a Black man. He was referred to as a Moor, which was kind of this blanket terminology to refer to someone from Northern Africa or the Middle East, typically someone whose first language was Arabic, may have been Muslim. So it's just kind of that blanket term. In the cultural context article that I printed out for you, it talks a bit about when this was performed. There was a lot of panic about immigration and kind of refugees in England at the time. And so it's likely that Shakespeare was trying to kind of make a point about treating people poorly because they aren't natives of that country. So thinking about the theme of the other and how that affects Othello internally and how other people treat him, because he's highly respected as a general. We see that in Act 1, how much the Duke and the Congress just highly, highly respect him. But he also marries a senator's daughter in Act 1, and how that sort of respect changes when it enters the personal realm. Again, Iago is just a fascinating villain because he is so evil and just clearly enjoys evil. Shakespeare would have been familiar with, and this is an interesting thing if you want to do more research about morality plays, pre-Shakespeare, so during the Tudor era, so think kind of Henry VIII, which was a generation before Shakespeare, there were really strict legal structures in place about theater and plays and what could or couldn't be performed. So the theatrical tradition of vice versus virtue, morality plays, there were actually laws in place that plays could only be performed if virtue wins in the end. There are some really interesting connections to this and even recent American film history, but this idea of plays and theater needing to have like a good moral, like that morality wins. So Shakespeare would have been kind of familiar with that recent history. And so we see that still in some of these plays, the idea of vice versus virtue. Othello is an example of a tragic hero. So he's of course our protagonist, but he's flawed. We're not meant to think he's perfect throughout. And we'll talk about that certainly throughout the play. He obtains self-knowledge at a terrible price. We'll talk about that as we go through the play. Desdemona is Othello's new wife. She's a senator's daughter. The play and film opens with their marriage. Emilia is Iago's wife. So they've been married for much longer. She's a bit older. These two characters are really important because they're both fairly complex female characters and have some conversations, especially toward the end of the play, that, and we'll talk about this more in depth, that seem quite progressive even 400 years later in terms of women's roles in relationships and society. So relevance today, we certainly still have conversations in our society about racism, about sexism. If we think about, and of course, this play, Shakespeare was English. This play was performed in England over 400 years ago. The play takes place in Italy. And we are in America in 2020. But when you put it in context and think about the fact that in America, interracial marriages were illegal in some states until the late 60s. It only became federally legal to have an interracial marriage in 1967. We certainly still talk about kind of women's roles and kind of how that's looked throughout history and marriage, and even in our recent history in the 60s and 70s. So while the play is 400 years old, a lot of the themes and conversations still seem quite fresh. The film version that we watch was done in 1995. I think you'll probably recognize Othello. It's Lawrence Fishburne. He was in The Matrix, which a lot of folks know him for. So this was 25 years ago. This is the first Hollywood film in which Othello was actually played by a Black man and not a white man in blackface. So again, the kind of newness still of these conversations. Oh, this is a terribly rendered image. You can see a better version of this file on Moodle. I pulled this up in our last class together, but just thinking about the setting. So how we start in Venice in Italy in Act 1. And the army is quickly called up. They have to go to Cyprus to defend Cyprus against the Turkish fleet. So starting in Act 2, we're in Cyprus for the rest of the play. So that's important, and there are actually some lines that talk about this. When we go to another location, that often kind of changes characters, right? Like, have you ever heard the phrase, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, right? You'll often see in plays and films this idea that when we go somewhere else, we might act differently or be more susceptible to certain things. And we certainly see that here. So that's kind of where we are in the world, in the play. Okay. All right. So that's just some of the important kind of historical context. There's so much to delve into, obviously, but just kind of having a firm understanding of where we are historically and geographically, and kind of our characters' motivations. So, again, the film adaptation that we're watching, it's linked in Moodle. It should be a direct link to the film. It might ask you to log in. Our library has done an incredible job of getting access to a lot of things that are sometimes hard to get access for. So like if we were together in class, I would be bringing in the DVD or showing you from my Amazon account the film. It's hard to find, just kind of out there. So you might need to log in, so using your college ID. But once you log in, you'll have access to Othello. At the end of the semester, when we watch Mad Max, that's up there as well. So be sure to start watching the film now. And in Moodle, in the description, I've given you the timestamps of when each act starts. So be thinking as you're reading and watching of the things that film can do that plays cannot. So in Shakespeare's time, the plays were performed during the day. They didn't have electricity, of course. So in the open, typically during the day. So lines of dialogue were used to describe times of the day. Costumes, characters would hold lamps, be wearing nightgowns to indicate that it was at night. Whereas in film, you can easily be set in the nighttime. And we see that in the first act. The fact that it's the middle of the night is really important in that first act. Film can also give us flashbacks. So as Othello becomes more and more jealous, we get to see what he's thinking. So he's imagining Desdemona and Cassio together, and that visual imagery that we can see via film, it has to be described in different ways in the play. So we see Othello a couple of times have a psychosomatic kind of epileptic fit when he's becoming more and more jealous and anxious about his fears of Desdemona and Cassio being together. That physical response that he has would have shown an audience member watching a play that like he is really messed up with these thoughts and kind of this psychosis that this jealousy is sending him into. Whereas a film version, you know, we still see him have those anxiety attacks, but we are also shown what's going on in his head, and that is quite effective. So be thinking about the difference in the theatrical version and a film version, what film can do and what plays can do. Okay, and then the essay. So I've gone ahead and posted the essay assignment. This is normally an in-class essay that we do. So the assignment is written in that way. By the end of this week, we'll talk a little bit more about what that's going to look like. This isn't going to be a super high stakes, you know, write a very long essay with a works cited page. I'm still going to try to replicate the in-class essay feel of this. I've given you a few sources. You can use one of those sources, the text, the film, nothing else beyond that. But you're going to be practicing critical literary analysis. So you'll choose one of those lenses, either race, gender, or psychoanalysis, to look through one of those lenses at the play to make an argument about what you imagine Shakespeare is trying to say. So we'll talk a bit more about that later this week. But for now, delve in. Read. My hope is that you will be finishing the play by the middle of next week, and we'll kind of move forward from then. So we'll have a discussion forum for each act, but just do your best to read. Reading out loud is helpful. You can watch as you read. Whatever works best for you, jump in and delve into Othello.